The journey had begun with a desperate prayer, a silent plea whispered into the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. Ilara, a woman carved from resilience and shadow, had crossed half a continent, her dreams heavy as the trunk that held her meager possessions. She was a mail-order bride, a notion whispered with a mixture of pity and scorn in the places she'd left behind, a final defiant act against a life that had offered her nothing but narrowing walls and stifling expectations. But even desperation had its cruel limits. The men who had lined the dusty boardwalks of the remote frontier town had been a gauntlet of judging eyes, their gazes like stones thrown at a pond, each ripple a judgment. Some had scoffed outright, their laughter harsh as splintered wood, their words barbed and sharp, pointing to the breadth of her shoulders, the fullness of her frame. "Too much, woman," one had sneered, his gaze dismissive, as if she were a horse to be weighed and found wanting. Another, a gaunt farmer with eyes like buried embers, had simply shaken his head, the gesture a sentence more damning than any insult. Her heart, a fragile thing despite its sturdy casing, had hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum of humiliation. She had known the world's cruel calculus for women of her hue, women of her shape. It was a constant negotiation, a battle for space, for breath, for acceptance. The rejection was not new. It was merely a sharper iteration of a lifelong anthem of inadequacy. Yet the sting was fresh, raw, tearing at the meticulously constructed armor she wore. The salt air, once a promise of new beginnings, now tasted of bitter ashes, of a hope that had curdled before it could even fully bloom. She stood there, a solitary figure against the relentless frontier wind, a monument to a pride that refused to shatter, even as the world chipped away at its edges. Her past, a mosaic of hushed secrets and public shames, pressed in, a cold hand on her spine, reminding her of every time she had been found wanting, every door slammed shut. The silence that followed the last man's retreat was deafening, a vacuum where dreams were meant to breathe. It was in this desolate quiet, this echo chamber of rejection, that the world seemed to hold its breath, poised on the precipice of another inevitable fall. The horizon stretched, vast and unyielding, mirroring the emptiness that threatened to consume her. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a shimmering haze, and Ilara felt the weight of every mile, every expectation, every whispered judgment pressing down on her. The faces of the men blurred into a collective mask of disappointment, a grim tableau she knew too well. She had seen it in the eyes of her own kin, in the subtle shifts of their smiles when she had dared to dream beyond the confines set for her. The silence stretched, long and suffocating, until it was abruptly cleaved by a voice, deep and resonant as the forest itself. It wasn't a voice that mocked or judged, but one that seemed to observe quietly, without preconceived notions. He stood apart from the others, a man of the woods, etched by labor and sun, his frame broad and solid, like the trees he felled. Elijah, his hands rough and calloused, held a quiet power. His eyes, the color of moss after a rain, met hers without flinching, without the quick, assessing glance that catalogued her flaws. "They ain't looking for a woman," he said, his voice slow, measured. "They looking for a shadow, a woman who can disappear, who won't stir the dust." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, not with scrutiny but with a strange, unhurried appreciation. "You ain't no shadow." A flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, or a defiance she hadn't known she possessed, sparked within her. He did not say she was too big, too loud, too present. He merely acknowledged her undeniable existence. "You got roots, I reckon," he continued, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Roots run deep. That's a rare thing out here." His words, unadorned and direct, cut through the clamor of her self-doubt. They were not a compliment in the traditional sense, but an observation that somehow held more weight than any flattery. Ilara's breath caught, a shallow gasp in the dry air. She had braced herself for another blow, another reason to curl inward, to disappear. Instead, this man, this Elijah, had seen not an obstacle, but a strength. His presence was like the sturdy trunk of an old-growth tree, immovable and deeply rooted. There was no artifice in his gaze, no pretense in his words, just a blunt, unsettling honesty. It unnerved her. This unexpected lack of expected rejection. All her life she had anticipated the sharp edge of disdain, the quick retreat of interest. This man, however, seemed to move toward it, to embrace it. He spoke of roots, and she, a woman adrift, felt a strange primal tug towards something solid, something anchored. But the distrust, a bitter seed planted long ago, still lingered. Was this a different kind of trap? A subtle, more insidious form of cruelty? She had learned that kindness often concealed its own sharper blade. The world had taught her that vigilance was her truest companion, and skepticism her most reliable shield. His simple observation, stripped of all artifice, left her exposed, vulnerable to a kind of hope she hadn't allowed herself to harbor in years. The dust of the town gave way to the deep, silent green of the pine forests, a world both vast and intimidating. Ilara found herself in Elijah's rough-hewn cabin, a structure that felt more grown from the earth than built by human hands. It was sparse, practical, filled with the scent of sawdust and pine sap, a stark contrast to the lace and frills of the city houses she had cleaned in another life. The silence here was different, too. Not the empty silence of rejection, but a silence pregnant with the murmur of leaves and the distant cry of unseen birds. It was a silence that demanded presence, that echoed with the weight of raw nature. Elijah's community was small, scattered homesteads carved out of the wilderness. The women, when she saw them, were lean and hardened by toil, their eyes holding a cautious appraisal that felt more like observation than judgment. But Ilara carried her own judgments, etched deep into her psyche by years of struggle. She saw their wary glances, interpreting them through the lens of her past, hearing the unspoken criticisms that had haunted her from birth. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, snaked through her whenever Elijah approached. Not a fear of violence, but of the unknown, of a kindness she didn't trust. Her mind, a tireless loom, wove narratives of betrayal, of the inevitable moment when he too would see her as too much, too different, too flawed. This wariness wasn't born of malice, but of survival. She remembered the whispered stories from her childhood, tales of women like her, full-figured and strong, who had been deemed burdens, cast aside for lighter, more pliable frames. She remembered Mama, her shoulders bowed by the weight of their world, her words often a lament for the fine bones she wished Ilara had inherited. And then there was the incident, a specific, searing memory that had driven her from her home. It was not just her size, but her very spirit, her refusal to shrink that had marked her. A local official, a man of small mind and great power, had made his intentions clear, his words laced with thinly veiled threats of what would happen if she didn't acquiesce, how her unmanageable nature would spell ruin for her family. He had called her a force of nature, but the words had been dripping with malice, a prophecy of destruction rather than a recognition of strength. She had fought back not with fists, but with a stubborn, silent defiance that had enraged him. The repercussions had been swift and brutal, a quiet campaign of social ostracization that had made her a pariah. She had left, not in defeat, but in a desperate flight for autonomy, for a space where her refusal to bend would not break those she loved. This was why the words, "You ain't no shadow," spoken by Elijah, resonated so deeply, yet filled her with such profound trepidation. He saw her, truly saw her. But what did that mean for a woman accustomed to being seen only as a problem? The air in the cabin, though warm from the hearth, still held the chill of her deep-seated anxieties. She watched him as he moved about, his quiet strength a palpable thing, and wondered if he too harbored secrets as dark and tangled as her own. The unknown, like the vast forest outside, stretched endlessly before her, a landscape both promising and perilous. Her mind reeled back, pulled by the insistent tide of memory, to the small clapboard house that had once been her world. The air, thick with the scent of simmering greens and freshly baked bread, still held the phantom echoes of her mother's weary sighs and her father's quiet strength. It was a home built on love and sacrifice, yet even within its walls, Ilara had felt the constant pressure to conform, to shrink. Her growth had been formidable from childhood, a towering presence that defied the dainty expectations placed upon young women. Big bones Ilara, her aunties would cluck, a robust frame for a robust world. But the world they spoke of was not kind to robust women, especially those with skin the color of rich earth. She remembered the dress, a pale blue muslin, carefully stitched by her mother for the church picnic. It was meant to be light, airy, but on Ilara it clung to her curves, accentuating every generous line. The whispers had started even before she reached the picnic grounds. Too much. Looks like a man. Shouldn't draw attention to herself. But the true catalyst, the spark that ignited the unquenchable fire of her flight, had been Mr. Silas Thorne. A man of significant means and even more significant influence in their small community, his gaze had often lingered on Ilara with an unsettling intensity. He was a pillar of the church, a benefactor, but his piety was a thin veneer over a predatory hunger. He had approached her at that same picnic, his smile a sickly sweet caricature, his words slithering into her ear like venom. He spoke of opportunities, of a position in his household that would set her up for life. But the subtext was a suffocating shroud, promising servitude of the most personal and degrading kind. He had mentioned her size then too, but not as a flaw. A woman of substance, he had purred, his eyes raking her form, capable of handling a man's needs. The implication had been brutal, a direct assault on her dignity. Her refusal, stark and immediate, had been met with a chilling threat. He had simply smiled, a thin, cruel line, and said, "You think you can defy the natural order, girl? A woman like you needs protection, a place. Without it, the world has a way of swallowing up those who are too independent." He hadn't needed to elaborate. She knew what he meant. The small jobs her father had relied upon dried up. The community's subtle disapproval turned into an open, frigid shoulder. The very air around her became toxic with silent judgment. She was a burden, a lightning rod for trouble, simply by existing in a way that defied their narrow expectations. It wasn't just her body. It was her spirit, her refusal to be tamed, that had become an affront. She had seen the despair in her mother's eyes, the quiet rage in her father's posture. To stay meant to condemn them to a life of perpetual struggle, perhaps worse. So she had made her choice, a desperate gamble on an unknown future, trading the stifling confines of a familiar hell for the perilous freedom of the frontier. The memory clung to her like a shroud, a constant reminder of the price of defying expectations, a wound that festered beneath the surface, making trust a luxury she could not afford. Days turned into weeks, marked by the steady rhythm of Elijah's life in the woods. He left before dawn, axe ringing through the crisp air, and returned at dusk, smelling of pine and honest sweat. Ilara, initially wary, found herself settling into a routine, cleaning the small cabin, tending to the meager garden, her hands, once skilled in fine embroidery, now learning the rough textures of frontier existence. Their interactions were minimal, a few words exchanged over meals, brief observations about the weather or the day's work. Yet within this sparse exchange, a fragile connection began to form, like tender shoots pushing through rocky soil. Elijah never commented on her size, never looked at her with anything but a steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to see beyond the superficial. He spoke of the forest as if it were a living entity, sharing its secrets in hushed tones, pointing out the subtle shifts in light, the calls of unseen creatures. He taught her to identify the different trees, the medicinal herbs hidden in the undergrowth, his patience a quiet marvel. One evening, a fierce storm trapped them inside. The wind howled, rattling the single window, and the rain lashed against the roof like a furious hand. Ilara, accustomed to the flimsy shelters of her transient life, felt a deep tremor of unease. But Elijah, seated by the fire, calmly sharpening his axe, radiated a quiet strength that was strangely comforting. He didn't offer empty reassurances, but his mere presence was an anchor. "The forest weathers many storms," he said, his voice barely audible above the tempest. "It bends. It does not break." His words, simple yet profound, seemed to extend beyond the trees, touching upon something deeper within her. She realized in that moment that his understanding of the wilderness mirrored his understanding of her. He didn't try to change her, to prune her back into a more acceptable shape. He seemed to see her innate strength, her capacity to withstand, and respected it. There was a raw honesty about him, a groundedness that she hadn't encountered in the polished, deceitful circles of her past. He spoke little of himself, yet his actions painted a clear picture of a man connected to the earth, to the rhythm of nature. His hands, though rough, moved with a surprising gentleness when he placed a steaming cup of tea before her, or when he quietly mended a tear in her rough-spun dress. This burgeoning sense of trust, however, was a double-edged sword. It opened a new vulnerability, a fear that this nascent connection, this fragile hope, would prove to be another illusion, another source of pain. Her heart, long accustomed to shielding itself, began to ache with the unfamiliar sensation of opening. She found herself watching him, trying to decipher the unspoken narratives in his steady eyes, searching for the crack in the facade, the hidden motive that surely lay beneath his quiet kindness. The forest, a vast green mystery, seemed to hold its breath around them, observing this slow, delicate unfurling of two solitary souls. The murmurs of the community, like the whispers of the wind through the pines, began to reach Alara. She'd catch snippets of conversations, stolen glances from the other women in the trading post. They spoke of Elijah, not with malice, but with a strange mixture of awe and apprehension. "He keeps to himself, that one," an older woman, Martha, had said, her voice low, her eyes flickering towards Alara. "Has for years, since—" She trailed off, her gaze meeting Alara's, a knowing sorrow in her eyes. "Since his wife." The words hung in the air, a phantom bell tolling a distant tragedy. It was an open loop, a half-finished story that only heightened the mystery surrounding Elijah. Why was he so isolated? What had happened to his wife? The questions gnawed at Alara, twisting her newfound fragile comfort into a knot of unease. Then there was Samuel, a burly, blustering man who ran the local sawmill. He was the kind of man who filled a room with his presence, and his opinions, voiced loudly and without filter, often reflected the rigid biases of the frontier. He embodied the very societal figures Alara had sought to escape. He'd often pass the cabin, his wagon creaking under its load of timber, and his gaze would linger on Alara, a familiar mixture of suspicion and grudging curiosity. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, he stopped his wagon, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Elijah always was one for strays," he rumbled, his voice laced with a thick irony that made Alara's skin prickle. "Takes on the broken things, brings them back to life. Good for him. Good for business, too." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, then back at the forest. The implication was clear. Alara was another one of Elijah's projects, a discarded thing he had salvaged. The words, meant to diminish, ignited a spark of defiant anger within her. She was no stray, no broken thing to be brought back to life. She was whole, albeit scarred, and her strength was her own. His gaze lingered on her, then dropped pointedly to her sturdy frame. "Hope you're strong enough for this life, girl," he added, a hint of challenge in his tone. "The woods don't take kindly to weakness, and they especially don't take kindly to surprises." The word surprises hung in the air, a subtle threat, an unsaid accusation. Was he referring to her race, her past, or something else entirely? Alara felt the familiar cold coil of suspicion tighten in her gut. She had known men like Samuel, men who used their words like blunt instruments, who wielded the power of their prejudice like a weapon. He had seen her strength and sought to diminish it, to remind her of her place. The tension, already present, now began to hum with a new, unsettling energy. Elijah's isolation, the quiet sorrow in Martha's eyes, and now Samuel's veiled warnings, all pointed to a story she didn't yet know, a layer of mystery beneath the calm surface of her new life. The quiet of the forest, once comforting, now felt heavy with unspoken truths, like the looming storm clouds that often gathered over the distant peaks. The answer came not from a confession, but from a forgotten, dust-laden box tucked beneath Elijah's bed. Alara, in her conscientious efforts to clean the cabin, had stumbled upon it, a small wooden box carved with delicate, unfamiliar symbols. Her fingers, hesitant at first, then compelled by an undeniable curiosity, pried open the lid. Inside, Nestled amongst dried wildflowers and a tarnished silver locket was a faded photograph. It showed Elijah, younger, his smile unburdened, standing beside a woman whose face was obscured by the wear of time, but whose hair was a striking, fiery red. And beneath the photograph, a crumpled newspaper clipping. The headline was stark, brutal, printed in faded ink: Lumberjack's wife lost in forest fire. The date, scrawled in faint pencil on the margin, was years ago, yet felt startlingly fresh. Her breath hitched. The fire, the reason for his isolation, the source of the community's hushed reverence and apprehension. But then another clipping, tucked beneath the first. This one was different. A small article from a distant town, speaking of a settlement destroyed by a catastrophic fire years before the one that claimed Elijah's wife. A community of free black families, their homes and livelihoods consumed by an inferno, its origin never truly explained. The article mentioned suspicions of foul play, but quickly dismissed them. It was a detail that resonated with a deep, unsettling familiarity within Ilara. She thought of her own community, the accidents that often befell those who sought independence, the easy dismissal of their suffering. A cold knot formed in her stomach. What was the connection? Why would Elijah keep this? His own tragedy, born of fire, stood in stark contrast to this other, more sinister blaze. The mystery deepened, intertwining his past with hers in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was not just a simple story of loss, but one potentially steeped in the same systemic cruelty she had fled. The symbols carved on the box, now that she looked closer, seemed to mimic patterns she had seen in her grandmother's old quilt. Patterns that spoke of escape, of hidden paths. A sense of unease settled over her, thick and heavy. Was this Elijah's silent tribute to a forgotten community, or something more? His quietness, once a source of comfort, now seemed to hold a deeper, more troubling silence. His perfection, in seeing her, in accepting her, now felt complicated, imbued with an unknown sorrow and perhaps a moral ambiguity she had not foreseen. The knowledge was a shard of glass in her heart, reflecting not only his past, but the persistent, insidious nature of the world's injustices. It begged the question, who was Elijah truly, and what did he know about the fires that consumed not just homes, but hope? The answer, she knew, would either bind them irrevocably or tear them apart. The air in the cabin was thick, not with the scent of pine, but with unspoken questions. Ilara held the newspaper clippings, her hands trembling slightly, the faded ink seeming to pulse with unspoken truths. When Elijah returned, his movements quiet as always, she placed them on the rough-hewn table between them. His gaze, usually steady and unwavering, faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something raw and exposed. He knew. He had known she would find them. The silence stretched, tense and suffocating, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. "You found them," he stated, his voice low, without accusation. It wasn't a question. "The fire," Ilara began, her voice hoarse. "The one that took your wife, and the other one. The settlement." He nodded, his jaw tight. "They're connected." Her heart hammered. "How?" He sighed, a deep, ragged sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "My wife, Lena. She was a fire watcher, loved the woods. But she also saw things others didn't want seen." His gaze met hers, holding a profound, shared understanding. She knew about the other fire, the one that destroyed the black settlement downriver years before. It wasn't an accident. She found proof, plans. Men who wanted that land wanted them gone. Ilara felt a chill seep into her bones. The irony, sharp and bitter, twisted in her gut. He, a white man, had lost his wife to the very same kind of insidious destruction that had pursued her own people. She was going to expose them, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. The men who orchestrated it. Powerful men. They found out. The accident that took Lena wasn't an accident, it was a warning, a message. His eyes, usually so calm, blazed with a muted fury, a pain that had festered in silence for too long. They used the fire to silence her, just like they used it to erase that community. The revelation hung in the air, a devastating truth. Elijah's silence, his isolation, his very choice to live so deeply entwined with the perilous wilderness. It was all a consequence of this dark secret, this unfinished vengeance. He was not just a widower. He was a keeper of a terrible justice, a man haunted by the shadows of a past that refused to lie buried. The moral ambiguity was not his. It was the world's, pressing in on him, forcing him to choose. "Why keep the clippings?" Ilara asked, her voice cracking. "Because the truth lives," he said, his gaze firm. "Even when men try to burn it away. Lena taught me that." He stood, his broad shoulders slumped slightly under an invisible weight. "And when I saw you on that boardwalk, Ilara, I saw something in your eyes. That same fire. That same defiance. You ain't no shadow, you ain't no broken thing. You're a torch, and you carry your own truth. I recognized it, I understood it." His blunt honesty, once unsettling, now felt like the foundation of a precipice, forcing them to either fall or build something new. The tension was palpable, a live wire humming between them, crackling with the weight of shared burdens and the dangerous potential of a defiant hope. The storm had broken, not overhead, but within the confines of the cabin. The silence that followed Elijah's confession was thick, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken pain and the shock of shared, profound understanding. Ilara felt the tremor of his grief, a silent, powerful force that resonated with her own buried wounds. His words, stripped bare of pretense, had not just revealed his past. They had laid bare the pervasive injustice that had pursued them both, a relentless shadow stretching across the land. The irony of their meeting, born of her desperation and his hidden sorrow, now seemed both cruel and inevitable. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time beyond the quiet strength in the kind eyes. She saw the lines of burden around his mouth, the haunted depth in his gaze. He was flawed, yes, not in the way she had imagined, but broken by a world that sought to silence truth and erase defiance. And in that moment, a profound shift occurred within her. Her own guardedness, her lifelong armor began to yield. The moral ambiguity she had attributed to him dissolved, replaced by a deep empathy for his unwavering commitment to a truth that had cost him everything. The weight of her own past, the shame of her size and her perceived inadequacy, now seemed less significant when contrasted with the vast, systemic cruelty that had touched both their lives. "Lena," Ilara said, her voice a soft murmur, the name feeling strange on her tongue yet strangely familiar. "She was brave." Elijah nodded, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "She was." He met Ilara's eyes, a raw vulnerability exposed. "I tried to forget, tried to bury it with the trees, but some truths, they don't stay buried. They haunt you until you face them." He spoke of the guilt he carried, the gnawing fear that he had failed Lena, that he had not been strong enough to protect her or to avenge her. It was a different kind of flaw, a human frailty that made him less mythical and more painfully real. And in that shared vulnerability, in the quiet admission of his deepest wound, Ilara found a mirror for her own. She too had tried to bury her past, the humiliation, the threats, the constant feeling of being too much. She too had harbored a silent anger, a defiant flame that refused to be extinguished. "No one is perfect, Elijah," she said, her voice gaining strength, echoing with the wisdom of her own hard-won battles. "Not in the way the world expects, but there is a different kind of perfection, a wholeness in facing the broken pieces within ourselves and still choosing to stand, to fight, to live." She rose, walking towards him, her movements slow, deliberate, her gaze unwavering. She didn't offer a gentle touch but a fierce, unyielding understanding. "You called me perfect," she reminded him, the words now imbued with a new, profound meaning. "But it's not my body or my spirit. It's the whole of me, the strength and the scars, the defiance and the fear. And in this moment, Elijah, seeing you, truly seeing you, I see a perfection too, a different kind, one that holds on to truth, even when it burns." The cabin, once a place of tension and guarded secrets, now felt like a crucible, forging something new and resilient between them, born of shared pain and the quiet, unwavering promise of a future forged in honesty. The quiet understanding that settled between them was not a fragile truce, but a sturdy foundation, built upon the bedrock of shared sorrow and defiant truth. The raw edges of their pasts, once sharp and solitary, now seemed to fit together, forming a mosaic of resilience. Ilara found a profound peace in the stillness of Elijah's company, a quiet acceptance that permeated every corner of the cabin, every rustle of the forest. He did not seek to fill the silence with idle chatter, but allowed it to breathe, a canvas for their thoughts and unspoken emotions. His gaze, once simply observant, now held a deep, unvarnished recognition of her true self, the woman beneath the armor, the spirit unbowed by a lifetime of prejudice. She understood now that his perfect had never been about physical beauty, nor a romantic ideal, but about seeing the complete, unapologetic truth of a person. It was about recognizing the strength in her defiance, the depth in her silence, the history etched into her very being. And in that recognition she found a solace she had never known, a sense of belonging that transcended the desperate circumstances of her arrival. The weight of being too much began to lift, replaced by a quiet pride in her own unwavering presence. She had spent her life shrinking, trying to fit into molds that were never meant for her. But here, in this remote corner of the world, with this man, she was simply Ilara, and that, she realized, was more than enough. The days stretched on, marked by the steadfast rhythm of the lumberjack's life, but imbued with a new quiet harmony. They did not speak of the injustices of the world often, but their silence spoke volumes. Their actions were their words, the shared labor of tending the land, the quiet companionship by the fire, the unspoken acknowledgement of the past that bound them. Ilara found strength in the forest, in its vastness and its capacity for renewal. She learned its language, its secrets, guided by Elijah's patient wisdom. She saw the ancient trees, standing tall and unyielding against the relentless wind, mirroring the strength she had found within herself. The scars remained, deep and indelible, but they no longer defined her. They were part of her story, chapters in a long, arduous journey that had led her to this unexpected sanctuary. The darkness of her past, the tense moments of her arrival, had given way to a resolution steeped in quiet hope. Not a blinding, unrealistic hope, but a grounded, resilient one, born of acceptance and truth. She understood that life would still present its challenges, that the shadows of prejudice would still linger, but she was no longer alone in facing them. She was rooted, truly rooted, not just in the fertile earth of this land, but in the unwavering acceptance of a man who saw her, truly saw her, and found her, in all her glorious, defiant entirety, to be simply perfect. And in that quiet affirmation, a future, unburdened by past judgments, began to unfurl, vast and full of unforeseen possibilities, like the boundless sky above the ancient, whispering trees.